Good evening, and welcome to this online lecture during which we will talk about the refugees in modern European history, why they were welcomed in certain periods and why at other times they were snubbed and rejected. I am Joanna Urbanek, curator at the museum and the moderator of tonight's event. Special thanks to Professor Philipp Ther, our speaker for this evening. This is the fourth debate in our online lecture series Envisioning Europe. It will last 60 minutes. We will start with a brief introductory speech by Dr. Constanze Itzel, our museum director. Then Professor Ther will deliver his lecture for around 35 minutes. And then it will be followed by the debate. To engage in dialogue, we would of course need your participation, so please feel free to leave your questions or comments in the comment section during Professor Ther's speech. We will pick them up during the final part of this event. Let's start. Constanze, the floor, or rather the screen, is yours.
Thank you, Joanna, and thank you, Professor Ther, for being with us. And of course, many thanks to all of you who joined us tonight. This evening, we will be talking about refugees in modern history. Migration, in fact, is probably as old as humankind itself. Its pre-modern phase begins with the movement of Homo erectus out of Africa across Eurasia about 1.75 million years ago. Much of what Europe is today was shaped by migrations. The early medieval migration movements have determined some present whereabouts of many people and their cultures. Migration throughout the centuries has strongly contributed to cultural and technical development through the exchange of ideas and products. As a result of this continuous cultural transfer, there is no culture that is not intercultural, actually. Migration can be voluntary or involuntary. Involuntary migration includes forced displacement, deportation, slave trade, trafficking of human beings, etc., etc. Flight happens usually from war, but not only. For example, the big emigration waves from Europe at the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century had their origins in poverty and bad living conditions in the midst of Europe's industrialization. The bloody wars of Europe's 20th century forced millions to move. Deportations were a means of terror in the National Socialist, Stalinist, and Communist regimes. And in 1945, there was virtually no territory in Central and Eastern Europe that was not affected by expulsions, forced migrations, and flight. So reasons vary, but in the end, migration is inextricably linked with either survival or the quest for a better life. Migration is present throughout the permanent exhibition of our museum, the House of European History in Brussels. Many different objects tell a story of continuous movement. Eventually, the exhibition points out how Europe has turned from a continent from which people emigrated in search of a better life to a continent that has become the destination for many in search of a better life in Europe. This European narrative, from an emigration to an immigration continent, hides myriads of personal stories. Stories of hope and deception, of survival and new life, but also of tragic death. A baby shoe washed up on a Tunisian beach sometime between 2003 and 2005 is a truly tragic symbol of the plight of such immigrants. The collection and presentation of such objects is part of an effort to preserve the memory of refugees. Today's refugees arriving in Europe with no belongings are also, in a way, stripped of their past. Museums and academic research can help explaining their stories. Dear Professor Ther, dear participants, this tragic symbol, the baby shoe, brings us to today, to the latest phase of migration, and to how we deal with it and the individuals it affects. To all the complexities we know related to the diversity of roles Europeans want to play, oscillating between restrictions and a welcoming approach. On the one side, we have those who call for reinforcing the European Union's external borders, who erect new walls and makeshift camps to protect their country from human beings entering. On the other side, we have those who see the positive contribution. In the words of Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary General, I'm quoting, "Migration powers economic growth, reduces inequalities, and connects diverse societies." One thing is certain, like English novelist and poet John Berger was spot on when he noted that emigration, and I'm quoting again, emigration, forced or chosen, across national frontiers or from village to metropolis, is the quintessential experience of our time. Thank you very much for being with us tonight, and I wish you all a very fruitful debate.
Thank you very much, Constanze. A quick reminder, please leave your questions in the comments section so that we can pick them up for the debate that will follow. Professor Ther, you now have the floor.
The origins of the two persons introducing me, I will briefly switch into saying Dankeschön für die Einladung. Serdeczne dziękuję za zaproszenie. I'm covering a timely topic again in view of the recent events on the western border of Belarus. And I'm kind of sick having to cover a timely topic again, basically also because I'm a historian. And so therefore, for the start, let us move back almost 100 years to sources pertaining to the situation back then at the fringes of Europe and its center in Berlin. The first source was produced by a commission of the League of Nations which inspected refugee camps in Greece. The members of that commission were having trouble to put their impressions into words. I'm now quoting. On a humanitarian side, imagination cannot encompass the event. Only those can attempt to understand who have seen destitution, misery, disease, and death in all their possible forms, and the scale of disaster is so unprecedented as to demand a new vision even from such persons, end of quote. A reporter for Foreign Affairs journal, who was traveling at the same time through Greece, made do with comparisons from the animal kingdom. I'm quoting again, the refugees maintained a fox-like existence in tents, wooden barracks, shelters of twigs, or of turf, even in caves. Further north, in Central Europe, it was too cold for these kind of accommodations, but the report that appeared in the Neue Berliner Zeitung about an immigrant neighborhood in the center of Berlin depicted the situation just as desperate. That boarding house is currently home to 120 Jewish refugees from the east. Many of the men arrived straight from Russian POW camps. Their ragged garments were a weird and wonderful hodgepodge of internationalist working class uniforms. In their eyes, I saw millennial sorrow. There were women there too. They carried the children on their backs like bundles of dirty washing. Other children who were scrabbling through a rickety world on crooked legs, gnawed on dry crusts. End of the citation. Bad hygienic conditions in close confinement, like the ones just we encountered, were an ideal breeding ground for diseases like typhus, dysentery, smallpox, tuberculosis, and influenza. Death was an ubiquitous companion to the homeless. In the Greek refugee camps, up to 70,000 people died from malnutrition, diseases, and epidemics, which shows also that there is at least some progress in European history ever since. Now, all these sources were produced in 1923. The author of the moving report about Berlin was the writer Josef Roth, who originated from Austria and Galicia and was forced to take flight several times during his life and eventually perished in exile. The two other passages cited above recount the misery of Greeks following the so-called exchange of populations agreed to internationally at the Conference of Lausanne. In Europe and its near neighborhood across the Mediterranean, a genuine refugee crisis was unfolding back then, in part along the same sea and Balkan routes we got to know again in 2015. The scale of mass flight, however, was much greater. All in all, about 7 million people were trying to escape the revolution and civil war in Russia, the Greco-Turkish War, and other wars and local conflicts in Eastern Europe. In this part of the continent, peace ensued only in 1923, hence we may speak about a long World War I. Now I think that we should enlarge not only timelines, but also the geographic concept of Europe. As in 2015, European history was deeply connected to that of neighboring regions in the Eastern Mediterranean. It does not make sense to draw a strict historiographic borderline in the Bosporus, the Caucasus, or the Urals. In the history of mass flight, there were always dense connections and correlations between Europe and what we have come to label as the Middle East. Moreover, in the history of refugee admission and international refugee politics, transatlantic connections were very important. Hence, the space of European history needs to be enlarged as well, also in that direction to the west. In the 1940s, around 4% of the global population were displaced, and at least 50 million people were on the run in Europe and its colonies. Also, many countries were destroyed by the war. They coped with the challenge to house and feed millions of destitute and desperate people. Hence, labeling the intake of around 1 million people in the EU in 2015-16 as a refugee crisis was in a way exaggerated. The main problem was the lack of a common political response. However, I'm starting this talk and the book I published a couple of years ago in much earlier periods with religious persecution and flight. In the late 17th century, around 180,000 French Calvinists were forced to leave France. So this was when the terms refuge and refugee were formed, which then moved over to English and other European languages. The French Constitution of 1793 harked back to the experience of the Huguenots and established the first asylum law in Western history, which was then taken up in the 19th century in various countries. Because of its religious roots, the term refugee was never neutral but affirmative. Now, most of the existing literature about refugees concentrates on mass flight, the hardship and misery it involves, and basically ends when people are pushed out. What happens to refugees after they flee home is cut off. My lecture today takes into account the history of refugees after their arrival in the respective host countries. Now, flight is always an individual experience, and this is why I invested a lot of time in researching biographical case studies. I will present some of them in the second part of my talk. Now, the easiest way to write this longue durée history of refugees would have been a strictly chronological approach. But I decided to structure this talk and also my book with a typology that distinguishes between religious flight, ethnic cleansing, and persecution on political or ideological grounds. I hope you will now see the PowerPoint which I transmitted to the House of European History. Now, of course, this typology is based on Weberian ideal types. The refugees were always driven by a mixture of micro-motives. Moreover, these categories have an overlap. Radical nationalism was very ideological, and in many parts of Europe, nationalists mobilized people based on religious lines of division. But this typology also makes sense because religious motives, nationalism, and ideological convictions shaped the admission of refugees in the receiving countries and their later lives. The early modern refugees were generally accepted not only as co-believers, but as harbingers of progress, as settlers and manufacturers who would strengthen the economy and the might of the countries of arrival. By taking in refugees, Prussia and other Protestant states presented themselves as havens of freedom and prosperity, as opposed to the dark states of Counter-Reformation. Now, over time, the Habsburgs and other Catholic dynasties recognized that they were losing this ideological battle and that economies suffered from the emigration of productive minorities. So eventually they became more tolerant, first to other Christians, later to Jews. This utilitarian approach was shared by the refugees who inscribed themselves into the history of the receiving countries by stressing how much they had contributed to their prosperity. These contributions were often exaggerated, but nevertheless, the utilitarian message stuck. Pays off to take in refugees. Now, this message, I think, has been lost too much in the past 50 years when refugee politics were mainly based on moral and humanitarian arguments. In the study of ethnic cleansing, it has often been taken for granted, so this is further down the slide, that the receiving countries would readily take in expelled members of the same nation. And I think it is very important to show how disputed co-national solidarity was. The mainland Greeks started seriously whether the arriving masses of refugees were of the same nationality. They discriminated against them, called them Turks, and did not want to share food flights or fields with them. The scenario in post-World War II Germany was similar. The refugees were hardly welcomed in the context of general hardship. But the co-national refugees had the big advantage that most of them got the citizenship of the receiving countries right away. Hence, they could make political claims and demand support through social policies. This, in turn, was very important for setting up the post-World War II welfare states. However, the price to be paid for political inclusion was often an increased ethnic nationalism, which sometimes caused even more violence and mass flight. So this is all covered in part 2, you can say. The admission of refugees based on political solidarities began with the French Revolution and was an invention of the left and the liberals. Following the Polish Grande Migration after the failed insurrection of 1831, the French government paid substantial subsidies to the 6,000 Poles residing in the country. The United States were back then not a favorite country of exile because the political refugees perceived America as too far from their countries of origin. By contrast, the German 48ers chose to go to the United States. They did so because their itinerary was pre-formed by labor migrants who had left on their own accord to build up a better life. This is, by the way, also one of the ways to distinguish labor migration from flight migration, where people were basically running for their lives. Now, due to previous contacts and networks, the Germans knew where they were going. Once more, the Refugees Agency was pivotal. In the 1850s and in the Civil War in the US, 48ers managed to inscribe themselves into American history as freedom fighters and to give the much larger German labor migration a political meaning. Migration was all about the benefit of the receiving society. Hence, when so many impoverished people and refugees arrived much later after World War I, in the context of a horrible pandemic, well, already back then, the US decided to close their borders. This one-sided utilitarianism made it then impossible to react adequately to the refugee crisis of the late 1930s. It was primarily the Cold War that set the stage for more permissive refugee politics. When the Hungarian uprising failed in 1956, 200,000 refugees came to Austria. You're listening to the talk from Vienna, within 3 months. It was clear that Austria was overburdened, and thus 90% of the Hungarian refugees were resettled internationally to 37 countries. US and Canada took the biggest quota of 35,000 each. Per capita, Switzerland admitted the highest amount of refugees. Now, the refugees from Hungary were admitted as the victims of a vicious totalitarian regime. If you then have a closer look at their regional distribution and professional backgrounds, this victim status is less clear. 10 times more Hungarians fled from the western regions and not from the east, where the Red Army had marched through in the fall of '56. So obviously, the mass exodus depended on previous knowledge that life in Austria might be better and on opportunities to escape. Among the first arrivals were many soldiers, party functionaries, and even members of the Secret Service. But former communist functionaries were admitted on the premise that they had entered the Communist Party involuntarily. So below the surface of a humanitarian West helping heroic freedom fighters, there was also a very sound economic base. The political refugees from Eastern Europe were mostly highly qualified and sought after on the labor market. Now, this system of international resettlement was then globalized in the late 1970s. After the communist victory, around 1 million Vietnamese, Laotians, and Cambodians fled overland and in sheer desperation over the South China Sea. Flight of the boat people who lavished in improvised camps in Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia, and even the faraway Philippines aroused the conscience of the Western world. none of the receiving Southeast Asian countries had signed the Geneva Convention, hence they did not feel obliged to feed and house the refugees. Eventually, the countries of first arrival were convinced to provide at least provisional shelter in the framework of the Orderly Departure Program. In return for not rejecting the refugees, an even broader coalition of Western countries than in 1956 promised to take them over and to resolve the humanitarian crisis in the South China Sea. The US submitted 370,000 so-called Indochina refugees. Australia, Canada, and the former colonial power France accepted 100,000 or slightly more refugees. In Europe, Norway was most generous compared to the size of its population, and it shows something like an international competition for humanitarianism. Now, in the US, yet another element functioned as a door opener. By taking in so many refugees from Asia, the civil rights movement attempted to build a multicultural society. Because of the demise of the Soviet Union, the admission of refugees then reached a second peak under Republican President George Bush. Then the numbers went down under Bill Clinton, but he enlarged the legal basis for refugee admissions. With the resettlement of former Yugoslavs, wars were de facto acknowledged as being covered by the Geneva Convention. Gang violence and gender-related violence were accepted in the administrative memo of the INS. So this was all in the mood of 1989, which was globally celebrated as a victory of human rights. Now, 9/11, 2001, interrupted the open door policy for the first time. In the two following years, less than 30,000 refugees were admitted because of security concerns. But afterwards, the figures went up again, and in his last year in office, George Walker Bush raised the legal ceilings for refugee admissions from 70,000 to 80,000. This move shows a still existing bipartisan commitment to humanitarianism. Over the course of the 36 years since the Refugee Act, the United States took in 3.4 million refugees through international resettlement. Thus, the US were the main pillar of support for the UNHCR and international conflict resolution. Now, immediately after taking office, President Trump ended this long tradition by ordering the suspension of refugee admissions. The refugee ban got much less media attention than the Muslim country ban, but it was because it was more an external than an interior issue. 2018, the admission of refugees, however, fell under the record low after 9/11. So one may ask, who has attacked America this time? Obviously, not somebody from outside. But anyway, why did I have this, long outreach in American history? Because also all this means that the EU must take on more responsibility. Now, in the US and in Europe, the turn against refugees can only be understood in the wider framework of general immigration politics. Europe started to close itself off in the mid-1970s, when the guest worker immigration and labor migration from the former colonies were stopped. As aforementioned, the Vietnamese were still accepted on humanitarian grounds. But the Poles, who arrived in Western Europe after the violent suppression of the Solidarność trade movement, were less welcome. The Poles were handicapped by the fact that there was no intervention by the Red Army producing ugly pictures and compassion like in 56 or 68. And Poland was landlocked as in the Eastern Bloc, hence few people got out initially. However, around 500,000 Poles left in the mid and late 1980s when the regime liberalized as a result of glasnost and perestroika. In contrast to earlier periods, now the US and Germany regarded those Poles mostly as economic migrants. In 1993, and you can say in contradiction to the values of 89, Germany de facto closed its doors for refugees in the so-called asylum compromise. Thereafter, refugees could be rejected any time if they had entered Germany through a so-called safe third country. These restrictions were officially motivated by the record number of asylum seekers after 89. However, more important long-term factors were the deepening economic crisis, high unemployment, and rising far-right activity. Since the 1980s, conservative politicians and media also warned against so-called economic refugees and pseudo-asylum seekers who would just take advantage of the welfare state. Germany then Europeanized the restrictions against refugees through the Dublin agreements. According to them, the first state where a refugee enters the EU is responsible for processing the entire asylum procedures. These regulations at first seemed to work. In 2005, the number of asylum seekers dropped to a record low. However, that was mostly due to a global decrease in the numbers of international refugees that lasted from the early 90s until the Arab Spring. Germany even then resisted obligatory European refugee quotas and the intra-EU resettlement of refugees as late as 2013. So the German open door policy in 2015 looked contradictory. But it should be noted that Angela Merkel did not literally open the borders. They were already open because of the Schengen treaties and the advanced state of European integration. Merkel only decided not to close the borders. Of course, one can criticize right-wing nationalists for the subsequent closure of the EU. But the restrictions against refugees are also connected to general migration politics, which were contradictory as well. Again, back to the US, like his Republican predecessor, Barack Obama, tried to halt labor migration from Latin America, and the deportation of so-called illegal migrants rose to a record level. At the same time, Obama allowed a small increase in refugee resettlements to the US. And I think this sickening line of distinction between illegal labor and legal flight migration could only be sustained by purely normative arguments. Now, undoubtedly, millions of refugees on this world are needy and miserable, as they are pictured in fundraising campaigns of many NGOs. But that turns them into mere objects of Western compassion and into easy targets for right-wing populists and nationalists. It has been mostly forgotten in recent times how refugees contributed to the wealth and welfare of Western societies. Now, because of time limitations, I will restrict myself to German and Austrian history for backing up the thesis. The intake of 12 million refugees from Central and Eastern Europe looked like an unbearable burden after World War II. In the fall of 1945, several German states started to deport refugees because they thought they could not feed them over the winter. Basically, the Allies saved them by ordering the distribution of refugees between the German Länder. Now, in 1949, refugees from East Germany became the main challenge for West German authorities. Since there were still more than 600,000 unemployed post-war refugees, the government initially intended to limit the immigration from the GDR. However, this produced ever more illegal East Germans residing in the West, whom the government could not send back to the GDR. Only half a decade later, this huge reservoir of labor helped to fuel the so-called economic miracle. Without the refugees, that is clear in retrospect, it would not have been as miraculous. Now, Austria, 40 years later, it also profited from the intake of refugees. The continuous brain drain in the post-war period was always partially compensated by the arrival of Hungarians, Czechs, Slovaks, and Poles. In the late 1990s, Austria then let 2/3 of the 90,000 Bosnian refugees stay after the Dayton Peace Agreement, in contrast to Germany, which sent them back. Now, the Bosnians integrated well and lifted the entire group of former Yugoslavs in the social statistics. Politics towards the Bosnians is also an example of how to combine an initial humanitarianism with a later pragmatic utilitarian approach. The juxtaposition between normative and utilitarian approaches in refugee policy is one of my guiding themes. In German, I would say Leitmotiv. And here you see some more of them on the next slide. Now, there is a simple reason for the aforementioned social mobility of former refugees. Except of total ethnic cleansing, fleeing depends on financial and educational resources. Hence, it was mostly a social elite which managed to get to the countries of arrival, always throughout history. The social selection is, of course, deplorable on humanitarian grounds, but it helped the refugees in their later lives. I believe that utilitarian arguments might help to increase the popular support for refugee admission. Also, the radical nationalists of our age will not be convinced by any rational argument. They are using the rising skepticism against any kind of migration as a leverage for banning refugee admission altogether. Well, I'm afraid that these skeptical remarks in refugee politics have distracted once more from the refugees. And so as the final part of my talk, I will now introduce some of the biographical case studies which I've introduced to balance the previous macro approach on refugee history. I have selected the case studies with qualitative and actor-centered sociology in mind. They all convey crucial and general information about the causes of flight, the escape routes, and the later lives of refugees. So wonderful, thanks for the slide. Now, at first, I would like to introduce the history of the family that you can see on the upper row of this slide. It was a Huguenot family, and one of the rare cases where we have an account of the very same flight written by two family members. And now I'm reading basically from a chapter. In 1687 and 88, the wealthy family Robillard de Champagne immigrated to England and the Netherlands via no less than 10 stations along their escape route. The 17-year-old daughter, Suzanne, had been sent on ahead with their 3 sisters and 2 little brothers, who were between 4 and 10 years old. She led them to a ship in La Rochelle, made sure they were kept quiet in the dark cargo hold when the royal inspectors came by, and paid the ship's captain, who was smuggling the 6 children to England for 1,000 livres. After the 7-day crossing, a conflict with the human trafficker transpired. He refused to drop off the children. Today, they would probably be classified as unaccompanied refugee minors at the harbor agreed upon. Instead, he deposited them along another section of the coast. Here, the 6 siblings were lucky enough to be taken in by a kind-hearted parson until they were able to walk to the originally negotiated destination. From the perspective of the teenager Suzanne, the worst experience, in addition to the long journey, was the anxious waiting for her mother. The devout Marie Robillard only arrived 3 months later because she had missed her first ship providing escape to England. On top of that, she had to leave an infant child behind in France. The emotional deprivations and the family's odyssey was not over upon its arrival in England. Out of fear of renewed persecution by the Catholic King James II, the family then emigrated to Holland. Now there, the mother focused all her energy on obtaining positions for her sons in court, in the civil service, and in the army. They succeeded quickly, since French culture and language were highly popular among European elites at the time. Now, at last, the father arrived a year later. The change of regime in England brought him professional opportunities. He entered into service for William of Orange as an officer, but then in the subsequent war, he suddenly died. And it was the grief occasioned by this loss that prompted the mother to compose her memoirs of flight, which were conveyed very dryly, not yet influenced by the later genre of the refugee epic. The eldest son, however, was able to take over his father's position and then pursued a good career in the English army. The rest of daughter Suzanne's life journey was much less fortunate. She was married off to a 67-year-old friend of her father, who died a few years later after the birth of their children. The impoverished widow had to ask several times for support from the estates of the Netherlands and then moved to North Germany. Her bitterness about this social downgrading and the lack of recognition from her family motivated Suzanne de la Montfouquet to write her memoirs about her family's flight, in which she emphasized her role as substitute mother and temporary head of the family. Also, it was often asserted in heroizing Huguenot narratives that the experience of exodus welded families together. This does not hold for the Robillards. There were disputes about inheritance, and there was little direct contact with the other siblings, owing to the geographical distances among the homes in various German principalities, the Netherlands, and Ireland. So widely scattered was the Robillard family. Now I would like to introduce the second family, which you can see on this PowerPoint slide. I think now we need to move down 2 slides. Yep, one more, please. These were again the Robias. Yeah, thank you. That's the right one. Now here you see the Dublon family from Erfurt, Germany. They were shoe traders and shopkeepers. In 1939, the family felt very lucky having obtained a ticket for the infamous boat St. Louis. Now, most of you certainly know the story of this passenger ship. It was turned away in Cuba and in Florida, and eventually the captain was forced to return to Europe. There, the refugees were distributed among various countries, but later a quarter of the roughly 1,000 passengers died in the Holocaust. The Dublon family was admitted to Belgium and they settled well in Brussels. They integrated quickly. The 2 daughters did well at school. But then in 1940, the German army invaded Belgium. The Dublins were rounded up 2 years later and all perished in Auschwitz. So there was nobody to tell their story until a German historian at the United States Holocaust Museum found a diary of one of the family members about the trip on the St. Louis. On the next slide, you see the face of yet another unknown refugee. His name was, please switch to the next one. Yep. So his name was Manuel Alarcón, and he stands for another failed flight. Alarcón was a communal worker who took the side of the Republican government in the Civil War in Spain. In 1939, he fled to France as a part of the Retirada, the retreat of the defeated Republican army. In France, he was interned in the refugee camp in Vernet-d'Ariège. In the fall of 1939, Alarcón returned to Spain because the French repatriation effort left him no alternative. In addition, he was worried about his wife and his 5 children who had stayed behind. Now, 1 year later, Alarcón was killed in the Franquist concentration camp Miranda del Ebro. His biography, presented here, rests on the private family archive, consisting of a small box with photos and fragments of letters. One could probably find 10,000 archives like this in Europe. So this is also one of the reasons why I'm giving this talk. Please, please keep these kind of collections if you have them in your families. Now, I'm turning my attention to another refugee, once very well known, a refugee from fascism and National Socialism, Manuel Sperber. Please, next slide. Yep. In the Cold War, Sperber became famous for his settling of accounts with communism and his autobiographically tinged novels. There are few 20th century authors who depicted the fate of refugees as movingly. And I will now read again from a case study which I included in my book. Sperber's family came from an East Galician town, which was heavily contested between the Austrian and the Russian army in World War I. The Sperbers fled 4 times from the Russians before they finally escaped to Vienna. There, the family found accommodations in a small bug-ridden apartment in Leopoldstadt, the Jewish and refugee district, where they quickly became impoverished. Hunger was as much a part of everyday life as freezing during the winter. In the first volume of his memoirs, Sperber impressively summarized his difficult years. I'm quoting now. Between 1916 and 18, sinking from level to level, I was to find out in endless detail that every fall can trigger a further deeper fall and that the abyss has no bottom. Only belatedly could Sperber start school at the local gymnasium, where he remained an outsider, hence the title of my talk in my book, and was pestered by an anti-Semitic teacher. The experience of being uprooted shaped Sperber's political career. After a brief flirtation with Zionism, he turned to communism and attempted to find an intellectual home and friends among other communists. In the late 1920s, he moved to Berlin, where he lived from lectures about individual psychology. But he spent most of his time as an activist for the German Communist Party and the Comintern. In March 1933, he was tracked down by SA men, but thanks to an intervention of the Polish embassy, Sperber was still a Polish citizen. He was released from jail after 1 month. After stays in Prague and Zagreb, where he quickly learned Serbo-Croatian, he made his way to Paris. Now, thanks to his work for exile newspapers and for French publishing houses, Sperber managed to make ends meet. So he needed to live very modestly. One visitor once noticed how his accommodations, a dark and confining hotel room in the Quartier Latin, was furnished with a table, a radio, and a hot plate. Now, owing to his talent for languages and his charisma, Sperber made a connection with the Parisian intellectual scene and befriended André Malraux, who would save his life a few years later. In spite of his successful professional integration, Sperber was critical of his environment. Quoting again, "The radical indifference of Parisians and the decided disinclination to be drawn into the life of refugees gives every one of us a personal freedom that is hardly known elsewhere. This freedom benefited the exiles, but it also allowed the poorest and the loneliest among them to perish, to drown on the cobblestones out in the open, in the presence of many people, without a single passerby, as much as turning around." End of the quote. After the Hitler-Stalin Pact, Sperber renounced communism and volunteered for the French army. Following demobilization, he hid out for almost 2 years in southern France, where his wife bore him a son in June 1942. 3 months later, following a warning from his friend André Malraux, he entrusted himself to a trafficker who was supposed to smuggle him across the mountains into Switzerland. The smuggler abandoned the refugee towards the evening at a fork in the trail. Disoriented from exhaustion, Sperber fell asleep on the side of the trail. At daybreak, he then found his way into Switzerland. After his arrival, he was interned at a prison-like camp, while his wife and small son, who managed to escape 2 weeks later, lived in another camp for over a year. After the war, the family finally moved back to Paris. Also, the eternal refugee was now finally able to settle down. He never got over the loss of so many friends from the period of the Second World War. His writings, such as the trilogy Like a Tear in the Ocean and his 3-part autobiography, in my view, superior to Stefan Zweig's Welt von Gestern, were permeated by a profound melancholy. The accounts by Suzanne Robillard, Sperber, and many other persons up here contain all the existential experiences of flight: violence, fear, loneliness, having nothing, and melancholy in retrospect. Now, towards the very end of my talk, I would like to explain how I'm combining my case study approach with the study of integration. This concept was developed by sociologist Emil Durkheim more than a century ago. Now, also, in my dissertation published 20 years ago, I compared historical processes of integration on various levels: citizenship, legal regulations, the labor market, incomes and social mobility, social contacts and life worlds, and marriage patterns. I did it back then, but today I simply have no time to tell you more about the integration on all these levels and of specific groups of refugees. But if you have specific questions, let's come back to that in the discussion. Now, some of you might not really esteem the term integration, which may appear like a surrogate of assimilation. Indeed, in past and current debates in Europe, the term integration often hides a bias for an ethnically homogeneous society. I always stress that integration is a two-sided process, and it does not necessarily end in the abolishment of all cultural and social pluralism. So please take my approach on integration of what is known in the US as the multiculturalism debate. Of course, the multi is very contested in Europe, and what remains among the political right is a pervasive and essentialist culturalism. I believe that the integration of refugees and other migrants is debated too much as a cultural problem and not as a social and class issue. And I would like to stress again that the receiving societies have almost always gained from the intake of refugees. That is a much different story, by the way, for the sending societies. Now, as a recent survey shows, the people who arrived in 2015 and 16 have so far integrated quite well in various European labor markets. But that does not change the bleak political situation for refugees, which has worsened because of COVID-19. The system of international resettlement has broken down. And if the EU can never find a consensus on refugee policy, it will not be a humanitarian one. However, at the moment, we are all facing yet another challenge. Belarusian dictator Lukashenko is using refugees and migrants as a weapon to destabilize the EU further damage its humanitarian credentials. That, I'm afraid, is pretty similar to what Hitler did with the Central European Jews in the late 1930s. The only way out of that is a proactive international refugee policy, but that is known since many years and not much has happened. We are living in truly bad times for refugees, but that tells us more about us than about them. Thank you for your attention. I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Professor Ther, for this fascinating lecture, also illustrated by individual examples, which is always very important. And I'm always impressed how the observations by Joseph Roth, which you also quoted, keep their actuality also today. We will now take up questions from our listeners. I would maybe start this round of questions with the following. During your lecture, you very eloquently described different approaches to refugees by the states. What can we learn from history about different models of integration or simply living together, and their consequences for refugees and their biographies?
Okay, thank you very much. I mean, this is, of course, a very big question. Nevertheless, I will try to answer it briefly. Well, the main thing is from an economic viewpoint, it pays off to invest in them, especially, strengthen resources to take up a job and to start a new life. That is what usually refugees want. So it starts with, language training. It goes on with vocational training. It can go on with educational programs. All this, of course, can be combined, but that is crucial. And of course, encourage the refugees also in other ways to do that. And that always pays off. Now, integration is a very multifaceted and complicated process, and not everything can be influenced by governmental policies. For example, the social level, right? Having contacts, which is so crucial to entering the labor market, of course, not only for refugees, but also for job seeking people residing in Europe and for post migrants, right? So much depends on social contacts and therefore on a societal level. And, how much contact and real support. With real support, I mean, not only, by utterings, by speeches, but by real pragmatic help, the societies are able and willing to deliver to refugees.
Thank you very much. And actually, my next question and point, which raised my interest, was those discussion on the quotas within the EU that you mentioned in 2015. We had a big discussion. The idea of quotas was abandoned. And do you encounter in your historical research similar discussion or maybe agreements regarding the policy towards refugees? Can we find such examples in history?
Yes, in a way. I mean, when I told about the Cold War, 1956, the Hungarians, they were distributed in very, very many countries. However, there was no quota. Like, a central authority decreeing quota. It was on a voluntary basis under very different circumstances. But basically, the Western world shared the burden. And there was a clear consciousness that then it will work, which it did. Of course, not always for the refugees, right? I mean, they were not always happy where they arrived at, but anyway, that was the policy, and that then was globalized when the Vietnamese came, and which was again voluntary. But there also was something like a humanitarian competition and even some pressure. For example, Japan, which never took in any larger number of refugees, then took in 10,000 people and considered itself as being part of the West. Nevertheless, admitting refugees is rather a Occidentalist tradition. We need to acknowledge that as well. Also in view of what is happening in the Middle East now, right? Some neighboring states took in refugees, others didn't, like the Gulf states, for example. Now the quotas in 2015 and 16. In the late 1990s, there was a distribution of the Yugoslav refugees, with Germany taking the main burden. That was driven rather by previous labor migration, so where they could find relatives. But then the countries did not reject those war refugees from Yugoslavia. What happened after the war is a different story. So anyway, an even quota in 2015-16 was in a way a continuation of the policy of the late 1990s. But unfortunately, then there was a larger disagreement than in 56, 68, or 1979. So this is the sad story about the so-called refugee crisis, which was mainly a political crisis. Would there have been alternative models than enforced quotas? However, I do think so. Initially, there was also readiness to take in refugees, for example, in Poland, among part of the church and local communities, across civil society organizations. So it was not given. This was then a political game started by right-wing populists and nationalists for their very specific purposes, playing with fear, playing with hatred, and unfortunately winning elections with that. That's the sad story, and because it was, in a way, a sadly successful strategy, it is kept up until today. But, there was a discussion about quota. There also can be a share of labor in other areas, and let's not forget, for example, Tadeusz Mazowiecki served as the envoy in Yugoslavia. So, there also could have been a sharing of responsibility maybe on that level.
Thank you. And sad reflection that we are facing now a situation maybe which is totally new and will aggravate in the future, knowing that the crisis caused by the climate change will be bigger and bigger. This is then yet to come, this big discussion. Now I have a question from the audience, from Ms. Marianna Wysocki, who is asking, what are the main shifts in regards to social mobility of refugees in Europe? Has this generally correlated with the openness of the refugees policy at a certain time?
Thank you for the question, Dobry večer. Well, one little comment on the climate crisis. This can be more compared to traditional, land, rural to the city migration. That is what it does first. Okay, then from the cities, then maybe from one country to another country, but I wouldn't stress too much the commonalities with mass flight. All the processes we have seen also as a result of wars. It's a more long-term process, which can be influenced and which is mainly a burden for the countries of origin and then their neighboring countries. But anyway, let's come to the. But it is a challenge, of course, a political challenge. But I would say on other grounds. Now your question about what contributes to that. Yes, we have social statistics from social research. Now, I'm mostly a social historian, but I also studied sociology, and I'm using a lot of sociology as well. And by the way, there's always reference to Polish sociology on various levels. And the thing is, the countries, this is almost like a catch-22, almost tautological. The countries which opened the labor markets early to let the refugees work are performing much better in integration. And the situation for them lavishing incomes in camps is of course the worst. There's something in between, which is sitting in some shelter in mass confinement and not being allowed to work. This is detrimental, and it is also expensive for the countries of arrival. Now, this is all known. The difficult thing is how to put that into political practice and how to convince countries to act accordingly. And here we have kind of detrimental effects through the rule of right-wing populists and nationalists. And until very recently, we've had it in Austria as well. I have to say here. So, it's also a self-fulfilling prophecy and something tautological about, you can say, destructive refugee politics. Unfortunately, sometimes it can pay off politically, but I think earlier or later, people are noticing that this is a charade, that all this nationalism is about distracting from other issues, either incompetence or worse, corruption. And I think over time, people are not stupid, nowhere, and they're noticing that.
I am now reading a second question from one of our listeners, from Marie Korman, who asks, are there examples in history where employees and shareholders who gained most from migrant workers paid the whole or most of the cost of their integration?
Not directly, but what they sometimes did, if there was, if they searched for labor, which often, of course, mean cheap labor, right? Let's not idealize the past. And sometimes, yes, they paid for the shelter. They basically provided almost everything to have the labor. Now, sometimes that included exploitation of their very labor. And so there was always complaints of refugees about how they were treated and sometimes how they were exploited. But yes, this sometimes happened that employers contributed to getting back the refugees, getting them back to work and helping them to start a new life on utilitarian grounds. And then, as a historian, you have to look very closely how that worked out and who benefited. Ideally, both sides.
Ideally, both sides, yes. And finally, I was really, as I mentioned, I was really impressed by individual stories you quoted, you told us about. So maybe I would like to close the discussion of today with a question to a beginner, to a reader who just would like to get to know a bit more about this historical perspective of refugees. Would you maybe recommend one personal account which was particularly fascinating for you of a refugee who describes his journey?
Well, yes. I mean, this is why I presented biographies. I mean, this is how I even structured the book. It starts on a macro approach, but then, the experience of flight is always individual. And I think it is so important to acknowledge that. Now, my favorite, I mean, there's so many fascinating stories, even of, Holocaust inmates pretending to be refugees, Germans, and thus surviving World War II. Which is an interesting counterexample to the widespread, martyrologia, which once upon a time also existed in Germany. Now, I don't have a favorite story, but if I would recommend, you to read an author, then get Manis Sperber. He's also translated into English, but you can only get it as a used book. So he's translated into German for sure, into English. I don't know whether into French. I would guess that because he lived in France all his life. And that is really high standard literature. I mean, really, really well written. It inspired me a lot in my own writing. And at the same time, it is a very moving account. But one can also access, you know, the Huguenot diary. It's also a good one. The other ones are often sad stories, but sometimes here we also get, you know, stories with a surprising happy end. Yeah. But it is important, by the way, there's also a European project documenting these kind of stories, interviewing people funded by the Europeans. It's so close. It's at the Universidad Autónoma in Barcelona. And so, you know, there's projects happening, documenting them, but also let's document what our families went through. Very often, it is a family experience. Of course, depending on the country, right? Less so in Switzerland. I mean, among the bio-Swiss, so to say. Certainly less often in southern France, but in rural France. But nevertheless, a lot of people in the grandparent generation or great grandparents, they have a case, and that's why I'm always saying, you know, look through the documents left behind by your forefathers, the boxes, the letters. Sometimes one can learn a lot from them. It's a more common European experience than one might think. I mean, if you simply put up a statistic, then you know, every fourth German or Pole has that kind of background in the family, at least. And it's very frequent, really. In Spain, of course, as well, because of the Civil War. Yeah. So, you know, go for it.
Thank you for this very, very important appeal. Speaking from Belgium, we are meeting refugees very often in different circumstances. So this is also history to be written, oral history to be written. Thank you very much. And of course, a multitude of examples can be found in your synthesis of the problem that you published. So this is also something to highly recommend to our listeners. I am very sorry that I cannot take more questions because we are now after 7, so we need to close. Thank you very much, Professor Ther. It was fascinating lecture and great having you with us this evening. And thank you very much, dear listeners. I wish you a pleasant evening.
Thank you.